I'm Bill Thompson, speaking to you from UC Irvine, and I was asked to talk about the issue of how to explain source conclusions to a lay audience. And we're dealing with the issue here of how forensic scientists should report conclusions when they compare items or traces of items in order to draw some conclusions about whether the underlying items have a common source. And we'll be talking about how experts should communicate their conclusions about such comparisons, which will involve two issues. One, I'll spend some time on what statements are justified logically and empirically. And then I'll talk about, among statements that might be justifiable, which ones are most likely to be understood and used appropriately by the intended audience. And this will get into the issue of lay perception. I think it's fair to say we're in a period of transition about the reporting of source conclusions. There's been a traditional kind of logic of source conclusions under which it was asserted that examiners could, through examination, discern whether items have or traces have patterns that are unique, meaning a shared unique pattern, meaning that they must be from the same source, or different, meaning they're from different sources. And there's been skepticism about this notion that examiners can discern uniqueness reliably. So the basic logic that says if the items share a unique pattern, they must have the same source has been breaking down. It's not so much skepticism over whether items have a unique pattern, but whether based upon the traces from the patterns that examiners can reliably determine that it is unique. DNA examiners, when they use statistical models to estimate random match probabilities, can set thresholds for determination of uniqueness. The FBI at one point suggested that if
Stacey just said they're not seeing your screen. Hold on for 1 second. Can I step in?
Sure.
Actually, that's right. We're not seeing the screen either.
What happened to the Zoom?
It's just we're happy looking at Bill.
Okay.
Aha.
You're sharing now. Now to get to the first slide.
Let's see.
We're not gonna. I hope he doesn't put on stop it every time they get to a horse attack.
This.
What?
Because we're using his gift card
Then where's
to
he?
fill up.
This.
Oh, there it is. You're right.
And then that one.
Back to your beginning.
All right.
Yes, okay.
Sorry, folks. Can you now see my screen and my lovely slides? All right. So let's continue. So what we're talking about is source conclusions from comparison of items such as these, and we're talking about what statements are justified logically and empirically and which statements will be understood. I'm saying we're in a period of transition where there's been criticism of the traditional logic that says that examiners can discern by examination whether items are different or whether they're unique, and thus whether they have the same source or a different source. So that logic has been criticized by the academic community. It's starting to break down. There's concerns about whether examiners can reliably distinguish whether patterns are rare enough. Interesting commentary on this in the recent AAAS report on latent print analysis, arguing that in order for latent print examiners to determine that a latent print pattern was unique among all human fingers, the pattern would have to occur at a rate of well under 1 in 100 billion. Whereas if the pattern occurred at a rate of, say, 1 in 10 billion, it's likely that it would not be unique and would repeat. And there's great skepticism about whether examiners, based upon their experience, could distinguish a 1 in 100 billion pattern from a 1 in 10 billion pattern. And thus the argument that examiners can discern uniqueness by examination has come under criticism. Well, I think a lot of the professional associations have backed away from claims of uniqueness and have instead asserted that they they can make a decision or can draw reasonable conclusions about source by relying on their knowledge, which is often very deep knowledge, of the degree of variation that exists in the patterns that they're examining within items and between items. So examiners, latent print examiners, tool-mark examiners, for example, may have deep knowledge of how much variation is likely to occur among the patterns they examine within the same item or between items, and can use that knowledge to make determinations. So this requires that examiners make some assessment of probability of the observed features in a particular comparison under two assumptions. One is if the items have the same source or if the items have a different source. And so what the examiner's thinking, sort of the logic of conclusions here, is the examiner's comparing the items and is thinking, well, I see certain discrepancies. How likely is it that I would see these if the items are from the same source? What are the chances I'd see so many similarities if they're from a different source? And this assessment of conditional probabilities then leads to a conclusion. These assessments of conditional probabilities might, in some disciplines, involve databases and formal modeling. In other disciplines that are less developed in terms of the statistical foundations, it may rest partly or entirely on a subjective expert judgment. Okay. Conceptually, we can, for statisticians, what's going on here then is that the examiner is assessing two hypotheses or propositions. Do these items come from the same source or a different source? There's some evidence which consists of observations on the control and on the trace that are being compared. And the examiner, in order to draw conclusions, is having to think about two conditional probabilities: the probability of the evidence under the hypothesis of same source and the probability of the evidence under the hypothesis of different source. That's the logic that examiners use, and in fact must use, which to lead to a conclusion about source determinations. Okay, so the logic of comparison dictates to some extent what the examiner can report. So how might the examiner report conclusions based upon this assessment of conditional probabilities? The most straightforward approach is to simply make statements about those conditional probabilities or about their ratio, which could be in the form of a likelihood ratio or Bayes factor. So the examiner could say something like, in my judgment, the observed findings are X times more probable if the items have the same source or if they have a different source. And this has been the recommended approach by some forensic science organizations, particularly the European Network of Forensic Science, European Network of Forensic Science Institutes. There's been some controversy about it. Our friends Steve Lund and Hari Iyer recently published a provocative paper in which they argue that it's extremely important when forensic scientists report likelihood ratios or numbers like this, that they recognize and acknowledge uncertainty that may underlie the number. And they talked about the possibility, rather than reporting a single number, perhaps reporting a range of numbers or different numbers under different assumptions, under what they call a pyramid of uncertainty or lattice of assumptions. I think this article was read by some as an attack on the whole notion of likelihood ratios. I read it more as advice to be careful about acknowledging uncertainty when one is talking about these conditional probabilities or these likelihood ratios, rather than a challenge to the whole idea of reporting results in this format. I mean, others are concerned that lay audiences may not understand likelihood ratios as numbers, or that there may not be sufficient justification scientifically for coming up with particular numbers, and would prefer that rather than having experts report likelihood ratios as numbers, that they simply make statements about the strength of support that the results provide for a hypothesis, which would be based roughly on an assessment of conditional probabilities, where the verbal tags would go up in value according to the size of the likelihood ratio. So if the likelihood ratio were, say, 100 or 1,000, they might say it provides moderately strong or extremely strong support for the proposition that the items have a common source, that the evidence is much more probable. So using verbal labels to state what is essentially a likelihood ratio. And other approaches are similar. It's been common in DNA testing to talk about random match probabilities, which are essentially a part of the likelihood ratio, the denominator of the likelihood ratio. It's an estimate of the probability of the evidence under the proposition of alternative source. So the expert could say something like the characteristics shared by these two items would be found in one item and X in the reference population. I think this could be appropriate in circumstances where the numerator of the likelihood ratio is 1 or close to 1. Might be misleading in cases where the numerator of the likelihood ratio would be well under 1. Another approach that's similar in terms of talking about the denominator of the likelihood ratio is approaches where the expert comments about the likelihood of the observed similarity of statements. This is a statement that came from the U.S. Army Lab. The Defense Forensic Science Service was using this for a while in connection with latent print evidence, saying something like, the likelihood of observing this amount of correspondence when two impressions made by different sources is considered extremely low. I view this as kind of a verbal random match probability estimate. All right, so those are some of the ways you might do it. The question that's commonly asked by forensic science examiners, particularly in the US though, is, well, why are we messing around with talking about the probability of the evidence under the hypotheses in various ways? Why can't examiners simply tell the jury what they want to know, which is, what's the probability that these two items can have the same source? This we call a source probability. So why can't examiners talk about the probability of the hypothesis given the evidence rather than making statements about the probability of the evidence under the hypotheses? So make some statement like, it's highly probable the defendant's shoe made this print, something like that. From a logical standpoint, these statements tend to be problematic. I'm not saying they shouldn't be done. We might decide that this is the right way to go, but it's important to recognize that statements like this require the examiner to make assumptions or take positions on matters that may be beyond their expertise, matters that are traditionally left to the trier of fact. Now, to illustrate this, I like to use an example I call the Elvis problem, to illustrate the importance of the examiner looking beyond the forensic science evidence in order to make some assessment of source probability. So here's the problem. So blood is deposited last week at a crime scene, and it has a DNA profile that matches that of Elvis Presley. And the question for you is, how low does the random match probability need to be for an expert to conclude that the blood probably came from Elvis? So think about this for a minute. Let's suppose the matching DNA profile, it matches Elvis's DNA profile, we know this, and the matching profile would be found in 1 person in a million. Is that low enough to conclude that it probably came from Elvis? What if it was 1 in 100 million? Is that low enough? 1 in a billion? Is that low? I mean, how low do we have to go? And people struggle with this. And they struggle with this for a reason. And the reason is that Elvis has a pretty good alibi. His alibi is that he's dead. You know, it's widely believed, although not universally believed, that Elvis died in 1979, although some people insist that he's still alive and continues to actively participate in Elvis impersonator contests. All right, so, but the point is, in order for you to make any kind of judgment about whether the DNA at the crime scene probably came from Elvis, you have to take a position on the question of whether Elvis is still alive and thus could have been the source. You know, the probability Elvis could have been the source is key to the whole thing. You really can't make any statement about source probability for Elvis without thinking about or taking a position on whether Elvis could have been the source, thus Elvis's alibi. And if you think about this, the same thing is also true in other criminal cases. In no criminal case where the evidence is going to be incriminating some suspect, placing the suspect at the crime scene, for example, can the examiner draw an ultimate conclusion about source probability without at least taking a position on whether the suspect could have been the source or how probable it was that the suspect could have been the source. That raises the question, should forensic scientists be basing their putatively scientific conclusions on things like assessment of the plausibility of suspects' alibis? Or should they be reaching scientific conclusions that rest upon an assumption about whether the suspect could have been the source? This is what makes the source probabilities problematic. From a Bayesian perspective, for you statisticians, the basic problem is this. The expert has lots of knowledge about the probability of the observed evidence under the assumption it's from the same or different source. So the expert is good, we think, at estimating conditional probabilities of seeing what is observed in the evidence if the items are from the same source or a different source. And the expert's trying to use that to draw conclusions about whether the items have or probably have the same source. So in order to draw conclusions about the posterior probabilities, the expert has to make assumptions about the prior probabilities. So the expert's knowledge of the conditionals goes into this part of the Bayesian equation. The conclusion the items have or probably have the same source is this part of the Bayesian equation. They have to be linked by assessment of the prior probability that the items have the same source. So the expert has to make certain assumptions about priors in order to come up with a source probability. Well, that may not be an insurmountable barrier, but we have to think about what assumptions the examiner should make about priors in order to come up with a source probability. Many forensic scientists, when asked about this, say, well, I make no assumption about the priors, but I think as the Elvis example illustrates, if you don't make any assumption or take no position in the priors, you really can't reach a conclusion about the posteriors, about the source probabilities, and so that limits examiners to statements about likelihood ratios or statements about the probability of the evidence under the hypotheses. Another approach might be to make a certain standard assumption in every case. In paternity cases, for example, an assumption is often made that the prior probability that the person who accused either is or isn't the father is 0.5, so equal priors. And this is thought of as kind of a neutral assumption. But making an assumption of equal priors or a probability of 0.5 isn't necessarily neutral, particularly in a criminal case. Like, for example, would it be like a neutral assumption to say, well, in the Elvis case, we'll just make a neutral assumption. We'll assume there's a 50-50 chance that he was the source of the blood at the crime scene as a starting point. Is that really neutral? I don't think I don't think so. So you see the problem. I think a more defensible position is that the expert could assume the prior is 1 over n, where n is the number of people on Earth if we're identifying a person, or if we're identifying a tool like a gun, 1 over n could be 1 over the number of guns of this type that have been produced. I think that there's grounds for that could be a reasonable, logically defensible approach. If experts use that approach, however, it's important that they specify that they are doing so when they compute source probabilities. What I often hear forensic scientists say that they do when thinking about these issues is more of a case-specific assessment. So in other words, what they assume about the prior may vary depending on facts of a particular case. So forensic scientists often say, well, I assume that my prior is 1 over n, where n is the population of plausible suspects. Well, this, of course, gets the expert into the position of trying to evaluate other evidence in the case. How many suspects are going to be plausible? Or maybe how likely is it based on other evidence that this suspect could have been the source, or that these two items could be this same source? So that gets the expert, that takes the expert beyond simply evaluating the traces and requires the expert to think about other evidence in the case, which raises questions. So should they be thinking about the suspect's rap sheet, his alibi? That then becomes problematic and raises questions about what the proper role of the forensic science expert should be in the legal process. Questions that need to be considered by forensic scientists if they're going to be presenting source probabilities. Another question is, well, why can't experts just give a bottom line, make a decision? Is this thing from the same source or not? Just say, well, in my judgment, defendant Xu made this print. And again, it depends on the possible basis for this conclusion. some people see this kind of decision as simply another source probability. You know, it's basically saying a source probability of 100% or 1, and thus it has all the problems of source probability. Others say, well, now it need not be a source probability. Maybe the expert could sort of set a threshold based upon the likelihood ratio, or the relative the relative likelihood of the observed evidence under the hypothesis. If the observed similarities between the items looked probable enough relative to getting that kind of similarity from different items, the expert could simply say it's past my threshold. I've set a threshold that passes my threshold. We'll call it a match, or we'll call it an identification, and we'll go from there. And we could maybe then assess how accurate those identifications are in the manner suggested by PCAST. You know, having hit rates and false positive rates could be done. One of the issues with that, however, is that this threshold, unless the threshold is set based upon a statistical model, it's going to rely a lot on the expert's subjective judgment. So this threshold is going to be set subjectively within the mind of the examiner, raising the possibility that different examiners could set different thresholds, and that's going to have implications for the meaning and value of the evidence that we need to think about when communicating it to a jury. The threshold that the expert sets for making this decision is going to have implications for the accuracy of the opinion. An expert who's a real stickler and sets a very high threshold and will only call an identification when it's really, 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 really clear might have a lower false positive rate, perhaps a higher false negative rate, than an expert who's a little more lenient about making those identification decisions. So the accuracy of the opinion is going to be affected by the threshold of decisions. And then questions are raised about what should the expert take into account when setting the threshold, or what might inadvertently affect the expert's threshold. Case-specific information may influence the expert's threshold of decision, which could then influence the accuracy of opinion. So this all has implications for how we characterize and talk about results. So these connections have to be considered carefully. Now, moving on to the second half of my talk, I've tried to outline some of the logical difficulties with different approaches. The research questions are questions about how do these different presentations affect people's perception of the strength of the evidence? How much weight do lay people give to likelihood ratios, or verbal tags, or random match probabilities, or level support statements relative to source probabilities or traditional categorical statements? Is it really, if source probabilities and definitive identifications, definitive source conclusions are problematic from a logical standpoint, is it really necessary that we give them? Would people give just as much weight to likelihood ratios? Or are likelihood ratios likely to be misperceived and misunderstood? So all these questions about human reaction to these statements come into the picture. The question is, do people understand the various statements? How do they understand them, and do they give them appropriate weight? In order to do research on this, we have to measure people's subjective impressions of the strength of the evidence. It's a psychological problem. It's not an easy thing to do, measuring how much weight somebody subjectively gives to a statement that somebody else makes. Psychologists have found over time that a bad way to do this is simply to ask people to rate the strength of statements using some numerical scale. Like, how strong is this statement about the source of these fingerprints? Would you give it a 10? 10 out of 10? 9 out of 10? 5 out of 10? Similar problem comes up in psychometrics, measuring subjective perceptions of things like weights and volumes. If I asked you, how loudly am I speaking right now on a scale of 1 to 10? Am I at a 5, 7, 8, 2? Your answer, likely the answer would vary widely across people, and it would vary widely from time to time depending on the context, right? So So this kind of thing is not a good way of measuring perception, just giving numerical ratings. Possible methods that seem to work better are two ways. One, researchers have used what we call a paired comparison method. I'll talk about that, where rather than rating the strength of a statement on a numerical scale, they rate the relative weight of two statements. I'll give you two statements, which one is stronger? That we get more reliable responses on. The other thing is you can measure the strength of evidence in the context of a trial simulation. You can look at how much weight people give to the evidence by looking at how much it changes their perceptions of the guilt of a suspect or the probability of that items have the same source in a broader context. So those are the two methods that are used. Let me talk first about some paired comparison studies that I've done here at Irvine with Rebecca Grady, Eric Lai, Hal Stern. These studies used participants recruited from an online pool, screened for suitability. They were asked to judge the relative strength of two statements about forensic science evidence. And we've looked at DNA evidence, fingerprint evidence. We're going to be trying some others soon. Two statements are presented, and participants are asked to judge which statement is stronger, meaning more convincing or conclusive. So here's an example. Which of the following statements seems stronger, meaning more convincing? Is it stronger for the expert to say, I identified the crime scene print as coming from the suspect, or it's highly probable that the suspect is the person who made the crime scene print? So we can pair up the statements, two statements against each other and see which one is seen as stronger. And the analysis uses something called Thurstone-Mosteller models. All right. So to give you some flavor of the results coming out of this, here's some results on the perceived strength of various statements that could be made about a shared DNA profile. And we have statements here of various types: likelihood ratios, random match probabilities, strength of support, and strength of support statements, and source probabilities, okay? And so source probabilities would be things like, was the source, highly probable is the source, could have been the source. And what we see here is a ranking of the statements in terms of which statement most often prevailed when paired with each of the other statements. So all of the statements are randomly paired with, each statement was randomly paired with all of the other statements. It's kind of like an athletic contest or a sports league, right? So each team plays the other team in the league, and then you see what their win-loss record is against all the other teams. So the one with the winning record here is the likelihood ratio. 10 million times more likely if the same source comes out at the top. 76% of the time it was rated as the stronger statement. So it's like for you Brits, it's like the Man City of statements. Whereas, could have been the sources down here at the bottom. So it prevailed only 7% of the time. It's, I don't know, what soccer team is at the bottom of the Premier League? Aston Villa? Crystal Palace? Oh, I thought they were better than that. Oh, well, shows what I know. So this is Alabama, and this is slippery. This one down at the bottom is Slippery Rock or something like that. And notice, I mean, even Alabama, I mean, even the strongest statement doesn't prevail all the time. Some people might think the random match probability 1 in 10 million is stronger, or extremely strong support is stronger. But so among the strong statements, the different colors show ones that are statistically significant, significantly different in terms of perceived strength. So the top statements, 1 in 10 million or random match probability, the 10 million comes out at the top. It's strong. Extremely strong support, which is I guess you could call it a verbal likelihood ratio, was up there pretty high, along with was the source and a likelihood ratio of 100,000. Random match probability of 1 in 100,000, very strong support, were a little lower. Highly probable was the source was much lower, and could have been the sources at the bottom. So this shows how statements are ranked. But one thing it suggests is that likelihood ratios, at least when they have big numbers like this, are coming out pretty high. We did a similar study involving fingerprint comparison with which involved different sets of statements. A statement about source probability, practically certain was the same source, comes out at the top, but not significantly different from a random match probability of 1 in 100,000, or a verbal likelihood ratio, extremely strong support for the same source. Okay, and you see other statements. Weak support for same source was appropriately enough at the bottom, not significantly different from a random match probability of 1 in 10. Right? So the value of these studies is it shows you roughly how people rank different kinds of statements. It's also possible to compare the way that people rank the statements in this study with the recommended verbal terminology for likelihood ratios that have been put out by groups. This is from the Association of Forensic Science Service Providers. They came up with a set of verbal labels to correspond with likelihood ratios. So if your likelihood ratio is between 100 and 1,000, you should say this provides moderately strong support. And you know, our ranking suggests that their verbal support scale corresponds roughly to how people evaluate these things, particularly at the lower end, maybe not good at the higher end. Yeah.
So there's a question on the chat about the sample size for these types of studies.
Most of these studies involve on the order of 100 to 200 people who are making judgments, each person making judgment about how many comparisons? 9 or 10 comparisons.
So I believe within each individual comparison, we made sure there were at least 40 comparisons. So because people did a selection of them, it was like we made sure that every cell had at least 40 people.
Okay, so this is Rebecca Grady, who worked on these studies, clarifying that within each cell, for each set of comparisons, we've got at least 40 people making each comparison. Each person makes a number of comparisons, 9 or 10 comparisons at a time. After that, they kind of get tired. So it's, and the comparisons that each person does are sort of a random draw from all the possible comparisons that could be done.
Is the percentage, is it a number of times it was on top?
Yes.
No, not in this table, no. This table is the kind of average win percentage. So it's, we did not have the statistical analysis had to do with each individual comparison and how it rated to other statements. But this table is the, like how often does that one win against each other? So like, for example, if 1 in 10 won over weak support, you know, some of the time and lost most of the time to the others, it's going to have a lower number.
Right. Yeah. So yeah. So
sometimes it wins head-to-head competition.
Yes.
Okay. I think I'm sorry. I misunderstood. Yeah, that is what you. I misunderstood. I apologize.
So this is
Some of them could be really weak.
Right.
You could have a really weak opponent.
Right.
I don't think
So
everyone can hear this.
right. And so there's questions about what the numbers mean, what these percentage numbers mean. You can view them. I mean, you could view this as, going back to the sports analogy, you could view this as being like the percentage win record, the percentage of time that weak support, when put up against a random draw of all these other statements, the percentage of times it won. Most of the time when a weak statement won, it won against another weak statement, not surprisingly, right? So weak support, I think, probably rarely have ever won against practical certainty, but it might have won quite, a few times against RMP of 1 in 10 or moderately probable or something like that. All right. So one more set of results of this type, just to give you a flavor of these results. We're submitting an article on this soon, so you'll be able to read more about it. This is another set of statements about fingerprint comparison. Here we threw in the term match, where the expert just says that the fingerprints match. And notice that comes out at the top, which is kind of interesting because match, match is a term that forensic scientists sometimes use to mean I can't distinguish them, but not necessarily to mean identification. So it suggests match may be a little dangerous. It's up there with 1 in 10 million random match probability. Notice match or 1 in 10 million random match probability come out above identified, individualized, which are in the same neighborhood as 1 in 100,000. They're a bit above extremely strong support. we threw an extremely low likelihood of correspondence using the recommended language from the Army lab that I mentioned before. It comes out between extremely strong support and a random match probability of 1 in 100,000. I mean, I think this is kind of interesting because this then raises questions. If this is where a statement like the Army statement is rated relative to numbers, we can ask, well, is that an appropriate place for it to be? Is this too low a value that people are putting on this? Or is, in light of the error rates we see in black box studies, is something between 1 in 1,000 and 1 in 100,000, is that about the right weight that we want people to give to such a statement? I think it raises interesting issues for discussion. So, emerging conclusions to come out of all of this. Likelihood ratios are perceived to be quite powerful. Strength of support statements can also be powerful. So concerns that if you give people a likelihood ratio, they're just going to ignore it, I think are not supported by these studies. Source probabilities are not stronger than alternatives. And so I don't, if this study suggests it's not necessary for forensic scientists to present source probabilities to get people to pay attention. Okay. The term match looks dangerous. The language proposed by the Defense Forensic Science Center, as I said, it falls between 1 in 100,000 and 1 in 1,000. Whether that's the right place for it is worthy of discussion. Individualization and identification are, they're perceived in similar strength to a random match probability of 1 in 100,000. So, it's not as if identification and individualization seem to be really the be-all and end-all of making this evidence convincing. Okay, let me say, I'll take a few more minutes. I want to talk about the jury simulation studies. I want to be sure there's time for questions, so I'll sort of speed through a bit of the trial simulation study work. I've done some of this work here at Irvine with Rebecca Grady, Aaron Newman, and I'll talk about research done by some others. Most of this work involves lay participants. Some of the studies involve people recruited from jury pools, so people who have actually served on juries. Others involve online workers. We don't find a lot of difference between those populations. They involve trial simulations where people generally read or are given information about the facts of a case and are asked to evaluate it, typically with or without or before or after receiving the forensic evidence. So it's an experimental design in which the goal is to see what people think about the probability of guilt or whether they will would convict with or without or before and after receiving forensic science evidence. In this context, a number of experimental variations are introduced. There can be variations in the strength or nature of the forensic evidence, in the presentation format, how the expert characterizes the evidence, which we'll focus on, the content of the testimony, whether it includes exhibits, graphics, and so on. And the key issue is what kind of presentations lead to the best understanding and the most appropriate response. Okay. Now, that, of course, raises the question of, well, what do we mean by an appropriate response? How can we judge whether somebody else's reaction to a forensic scientist's testimony is an appropriate reaction or not? We've used 3 criteria, and these may not be the sole criterion. We look at whether people's responses are sensitive to the strength of the forensic evidence. In other words, do they give more weight to stronger evidence and less weight to weaker evidence? That's one dimension of appropriateness. Do they interpret the expert's testimony correctly? And particularly, we're concerned about whether they are tripped up or susceptible to fallacious interpretations of the expert's testimony. So, fallacy. If the expert is presenting them information about the conditional probability of the evidence under the hypothesis, do they interpret that to mean, do they interpret that as the probability of the hypothesis is true in light of the evidence? The other question is which kinds of presentations lead to the most logically coherent responses. Do people update the evidence in a manner that's consistent with Bayesian reasoning, or does a presentation lead them to make statements about the evidence that are logically inconsistent with one another? If so, that's a red flag for us. Okay. Sensitivity to strength of evidence. The research shows generally people respond appropriately to match probabilities. Likelihood ratio is kind of mixed on that. I think there's more research needed on whether people are sensitive to the value of likelihood ratios. They seem to be under some circumstances, not under others. We need more research on that. Verbal statements also, we often see inconsistent responses. These are results I'll skip over from an important study by Christy Martiri and her colleagues at University of New South Wales that showed that for a study they looked at, they presented widely different values of likelihood ratios and found that people gave basically the same weightings to the evidence, which is not good, suggesting people are not sensitive to differences in the value of the likelihood ratio when weighting the evidence. On the other hand, we did a study here at Irvine where we found that people were sensitive to the value of likelihood ratios and random match probabilities and verbal tags with DNA evidence, but not with shoe print evidence. So something about there are interesting interactions between the nature of the evidence and people's perceptions about the strength of the evidence that makes people open to hearing differences in the likelihood ratio and giving weight to them for DNA. With shoe print evidence, there seemed to be great skepticism about large likelihood ratios, maybe because of people's doubts about the value of shoe print evidence generally that interfered with their ability to respond to it appropriately. We've done other studies where we look at presentation of likelihood ratios. One of our bigger sets of studies involve likelihood ratios for voice comparison evidence by this expert, Jeff Morrison, who's a prominent voice comparison expert and a prominent commentator on the use of likelihood ratios. These studies are interesting because they involve Jeff giving simulated testimony. So we have somebody who's quite an expert explaining likelihood ratios as well as he can in the context of a case to see how well people understand and interpret likelihood ratios when explained by an expert in likelihood ratios. And we found in this study people's verdicts generally were responsive to the value of the likelihood ratio, which was in this case, either 30 or 3,000, and they also were sensitive to the strength of other evidence in the case. So that looked good. I'll skip this slide. And we found that, so people this is another slide showing people are responsive to the strength of the likelihood ratios. The real question that was raised about likelihood ratios is whether they were correctly interpreted. When we asked people what they thought the statements about likelihood ratios meant, a large percentage of them misinterpreted the likelihood ratios as being source probabilities. All right, so likelihood ratios were given weight, but perhaps because people misunderstood them as being something other than what they are, which raises important questions. And these misunderstandings of what the likelihood ratio means, so the fallacious interpretations of evidence we found it actually influenced the weights given to evidence in important ways. So these fallacious interpretations are something we do need to be concerned about. Whether people give the appropriate weight to evidence, there is a lot of evidence in the literature that people underweight forensic evidence relative to Bayesian norms for various reasons. But it appears not always to be the case. It's complicated to analyze this. It appears to depend on context, and there's at least some evidence that people can overweight forensic science evidence relative to Bayesian norms under some circumstances. And so, again, appropriate weight is another thing that needs to be examined. I'll skip over the evidence on this and just get to my conclusion. What is the best way to present source conclusions so that people understand them? I think the only conclusion at this point is simply more research needed. We're beginning to get a handle on this. We're making progress, but obviously these are complicated issues on which we need a lot more work. So I want to thank NIST and CSAFE for support for this. There's my contact information, and I'll say thank you very much and take some questions.
Thanks, Bill.
All right.
Boisterous applause in Irvine. This is Hal Stern at UC Irvine. We have not been able to hear audio, although thankfully everyone could hear Bill. I'll read some questions from the chat. So if you have a question, you can chat it out. You can unmute and we can test it, but we haven't heard Iowa State. That's the only thing we know for sure. We have limited time, so let me read the questions we have. And if you have one, please type it in. So the one question is, there are a couple of logistics things. People want to know if they can hear the presentation later, and you can at the CSAFE website. They want to know where it's going to be published, and I think Bill would like to know where it's going to be published too.
I think we're going to submit one paper to Law, Probability, and Risk. There's a paper, the Elvis example is kind of elaborated in a paper that I wrote with some colleagues from the University of Lausanne, Alex Biederman, Franco Cheroni. It's been accepted by Judicature, which is a judges magazine. So those of you, the judges are all going to be hearing about the Elvis example. So you forensic scientists should bone up on it as well. So that paper, the Judicature paper, we should be able to release a pre-publication draft of that within the next couple of weeks.
Great. And people want to know about getting a copy of the PowerPoint. I believe that will also be available.
Yeah, I'll happy to circulate and post the PowerPoint.
So in terms of some of the substantive questions, Steve Brock asked if in the second half of your talk you show people are often not sensitive to differences in likelihood ratios being presented to them.
Yes.
Why would we want to move to a system delivering evidence using likelihood ratios?
Well, I think part of the answer is because there are conceptual difficulties with the alternatives. I think that this research, to be fair, shows that people can be sensitive to likelihood ratios. We found they were sensitive to likelihood ratio values when evaluating DNA evidence and when evaluating voice print evidence. There are some methodological issues with the studies that showed insensitivity that we need to address. With regard to the footwear evidence, the results are kind of interesting. People actually giving less weight to the footwear evidence when you gave a big likelihood ratio. I think that what may have been going on there is some people's own intuitions about the value of footwear evidence were conflicting with the numbers that the expert was putting out in ways that caused them to react to that. That raises a really interesting question that forensic scientists need to know about how people respond to evidence. So it may be that in a footwear case, a lot more effort needs to go into explaining the scientific basis for the conclusions and likelihood ratios in order to get people to accept them. And so that raises additional issues we need to look at through further research. And I think we all agree we want people to give more weight to strong evidence than weak evidence. The question is, how do we get them to do that?
Great, thank you. Next question, have any studies been done to assess different people, analysts, experts making the same statements to determine whether jurors trust some experts more than others?
Not that I'm aware of. It's an interesting question. And we'd certainly thought about that, in connection with the studies that we've done, particularly studies where an expert is giving testimony. One of the questions we need to answer is to what extent are the results of the studies that we see dependent upon the particular expert who's speaking, and we need to look into that more.
That's all I have here. One new message. I actually want to take back control. Okay. Do you have an idea of which direction the more research should focus on?
Well, I think we need a lot more. Research on likelihood ratio presentation and perceptions. So there are a lot of forensic science methods for which likelihood ratios are the preferred reporting method. Voice comparison is a good example. DNA analysis, particularly involving mixed or incomplete samples. In order to effectively characterize the strength of the evidence, the expert has to use a likelihood ratio. And so I think inevitably some forensic science is going to be presented using likelihood ratios or something equivalent to likelihood ratios. And so we need to spend more time thinking about how to convey those in an appropriate manner. It may be that we'll decide that we need to convert the likelihood ratio into something else that is more easily understood. But that's also an issue worthy of examination. And so, so my sense is that there's a lot to do in this area, a lot we don't know.
Great. A couple of questions came in. One from Sweden. It says, in Sweden, we use a likelihood ratio scale accompanied by a vocal scale. I don't know what that means. Are there any studies that change how that changes how people understand the evidence? So I interpret that to mean that what the Swedish do is present a number and then present some sort of verbal characterization of the number. So they come in and say, the likelihood ratio we've computed is 1,000, and that means that there's fairly strong support for the proposition, or strong support for the proposition of same source over different source. In the studies that we've done here so far, we've separated the number from the verbal characterization. We have not yet done studies where we present them both together. It seems to me that presenting both together is probably a good idea. But again, I think we need further research on that. Great. A question, I guess, or some clarification. The studies that you're doing, when the people are exposed to expert witness testimony about statements, or are they merely shown the statements in no context, just which of these?
In the studies that involved pairwise comparison of statements, they're simply presented with the two statements. All they're told is that an expert has compared two fingerprints to determine whether they were made by the same finger, and here's two statements. Which statement do you consider to be stronger? The second set of studies, the trial simulations, involve putting the expert's testimony in broader context. And so those studies typically provide a background information about a hypothetical case, which can be presented with more or less detail depending on the study, and then present expert testimony in the context of that case. So both ways.
Right. And maybe last comment is someone says, I'd be interested to see the same research done in different areas. I bet we get different results based on location.
Well, that's an interesting question. So whether people in Pennsylvania respond differently to this kind of evidence than people in California, I mean, we do wonder about that. I mean, we've tried, particularly in studies where we involve recruiting people online and recruiting people from jury pools. We're quite attentive to their background, and we try to get demographic and background information and link that to their performance. We have some evidence. We have some evidence from some of these studies that people who are better educated, college-educated people, among people recruited from jury pools, for example, college-educated jurors do better on some kinds of tasks. There's one study that we published recently involved people drawing inferences about negative evidence. What inferences can be drawn from the failure to detect something? You know, when is absence of evidence evidence of absence? And it looked like college-educated people recruited from jury pools were better at thinking through those kinds of problems than people who weren't college-educated. Perhaps not surprising. Smarter people do better on complicated problems. That, I think, needs to be taken into account as well, and the experts may need to gauge the level of their testimony based on what the level of about the kind of people who they're communicating with.
Great. Thanks for all that, Bill. We're going to turn it back to Iowa State because the folks there have a couple of announcements. So thank you. Turn my sound and see if we can hear.
Okay, can everybody hear us except for the UCI folk?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, now you can hear us? Yes. Great. So I have exactly one slide that I want to put up. Where is it?
Let's go.
Hold on a minute, please. There.
Mine.
I think it was the top one.
Oh.
Yeah,
You want to turn your computer down?
next one. Oh, this was supposed to be the introduction. Wait a minute. All right, this was.
Somebody has got us.
Elisa, you may have to turn down the room speakers in order to get rid of the feedback.
Which
I'm not
speaker?
sure that
You'll just.
word
mute
the
his.
speaker.
Okay, how are we now? Okay, good. So the one slide I wanted to show. January 1819 in Arlington, Virginia. And if anybody's interested in attending, let us know. We will have the next Centerwide webinar on January 31st. This is going to be presented by the CMU crowd, Xiao Wei Tai in particular, and she's going to talk about cartridge case analysis. So she's going to look at comparison of cartridge cases. Not there, on February 18, CSAFE is sponsoring an invited session at the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences, which is taking place in Austin. So if anybody's going to be there, please come see us. We have a booth at the meetings of the American